A cargo ship is sailing at 17 knots through the North Arabian Sea. The most powerful navy on Earth is standing directly in its path. The warnings have been going out for 6 straight hours. Radio calls, formal naval instructions, direct orders to stop, to alter course, to respond, 6 hours, and the captain of that ship does absolutely nothing. He keeps sailing, straight ahead, as if the USS Bruins, a guided missile destroyer of the United States Navy, is simply not there. That is where this story begins. Because the question you need to answer right now, before anything else, is this. What could possibly be in the hull of that ship that would make a captain choose to have his engine room blown apart by 5-inch naval gunfire rather than simply turn around and go home? On the morning of April 19, 2026, the United States Navy did something that no analyst seriously believed Washington was willing to do. After 6 full hours of warnings that were met with complete silence, the guided missile destroyer USS Bruins opened fire on the engine room of an Iranian-flagged cargo vessel called the MV Tuska. Within minutes, U.S. Marines from the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit were fast roping from helicopters launched off the amphibious assault ship USS Tripoli directly onto the deck of that ship. The vessel was disabled, the crew was seized, and what American forces found inside those containers is now sitting in laboratories that the Pentagon will not even publicly identify. 2 days later, on April 21st, the entire world was watching the fallout unfold in real time. But the full story of what actually happened, why it happened, and what it means for the next decade of global power, that story has not been told completely anywhere until now. Let's start with the voyage itself, because the route this ship took was not a commercial run. It was a precisely choreographed operation. According to ship tracking data compiled by the global intelligence firm Kepler and verified by Reuters, The Washington Post, and Newsweek, the Tuska departed the Iranian port of Shahed Rajeh on February 22, 2026. That is 6 days before the war between Iran, Israel, and the United States officially began. From there, it transited the Strait of Malacca in early March. It docked at Gaolan Port in Zhuhai on China's southeastern coast on March 9th. Then it moved north to Taikang Port near Shanghai on March 25th, before returning to Gaolan on March 29th and 30th to load containers. After that, it stopped at Port Klang Anchorage in Malaysia on April 11th and 12th, in a maneuver that maritime analysts immediately recognized as a textbook ship-to-ship transshipment. You use that technique specifically to disguise where your cargo originally came from. Then, with those containers fully loaded, the Tuska began its run through the Gulf of Oman toward Bandar Abbas, the primary Iranian naval and commercial port. That is when the USS Bruins moved into its path. That is when the 6 hours of warnings began, and that is when the captain made the calculation that what he was carrying was worth the risk of naval gunfire. Now here is where it gets extraordinarily serious. The cargo question is no longer a question. According to Reuters, citing U.S. maritime security sources, the Tuska was carrying what Washington officially classifies as dual-use items. That phrase, dual use, is the diplomatic language for materials that have a civilian cover story, but a military end use. The Washington Post specifically identified Gaolan Port in Zhuhai as a known loading point for sodium perchlorate. Sodium perchlorate is the primary precursor for ammonium perchlorate, which is the oxidizer in solid rocket fuel propellant. Without it, you cannot build ballistic missiles at scale. And according to analysis published by The Telegraph, 5 previous shipments from that same port aboard Iranian-flagged vessels named the Hamuna, the Barzan, the Shabdis, the Ryan, and the Zardis had already delivered enough sodium perchlorate to Iran to produce propellant for approximately 785 additional ballistic missiles. That is enough fuel to sustain Iranian launch rates of between 10 and 30 missiles per day for roughly a full month of sustained operations. Sodium perchlorate is the chemical that powers Iran's Fateh, Zulfikar, Qiyam, Khaybar Sheikhan, Hajj Qasim, and Fatah missile families. These are the exact missiles that have been striking Saudi oil infrastructure, American military bases across the Gulf, and civilian infrastructure inside Israel since March of 2026. And the Tuska, according to the converging assessments of U.S. Central Command, the Department of the Treasury, and multiple senior American officials, was attempting to add to that stockpile while a U.S. brokered ceasefire was technically still in effect, while Vice President J.D. Vance was preparing to fly to Islamabad for a second round of peace talks, while the entire diplomatic architecture of the negotiation track depended on the assumption that Iran was bargaining in good faith. Think about that timing carefully because it tells you something fundamental about the gap between what Iran was saying at the negotiating table and what Iran was actually doing in the water. Now let's talk about China, because the contradiction between Beijing's public posture and Beijing's apparent behavior in this window is so stark that no statement from any foreign ministry can paper it over. According to Bloomberg reporting from mid-April 2026, Chinese President Xi Jinping personally telephoned Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and told him that the Strait of Hormuz must remain open as an international waterway. Bloomberg described this as Xi's most explicit public statement against Iranian closure of the strait since the war began. China's official position, delivered directly to the leader of the most important Sunni oil-producing state in the Gulf, was that commercial navigation must be protected. And simultaneously, on April 15th, just 4 days before the Tuska seizure, President Trump revealed in a Fox Business interview that he had personally written to Xi Jinping requesting that Beijing not provide weapons to Iran during the conflict. The White House confirmed the same day that Xi had assured Trump in writing that China would not supply weapons. 4 days later, the USS Bruins fired on a vessel that had loaded containers at a Chinese port identified as a sodium perchlorate hub while sailing under an Iranian flag toward an Iranian military port. Either Xi did not know what was being loaded at Gaolan, in which case the Chinese central government does not actually control the supply networks operating in its name, or Xi did know, in which case he lied directly to the President of the United States in writing. Both interpretations are catastrophic for Beijing's diplomatic standing. Both are now being analyzed in real time inside Washington, inside Riyadh, inside Tel Aviv, and inside every Gulf capital that has spent the past 2 decades trying to balance Chinese economic ties against American security guarantees. Beijing's public response to the seizure was revealing in the most uncomfortable possible way. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Guo Jiakun was asked directly whether the Tuska had been carrying rocket fuel precursors loaded in China. His answer was carefully crafted to sound like a denial without actually being one. As far as I know, he said, it is a foreign flag container ship. China opposes any malicious association and hyping up of the issue. And in the same news cycle, the same foreign ministry separately expressed what it called concern about the United States intercepting an Iranian commercial vessel. So in the same 48-hour window, Beijing's official position was that the ship had nothing to do with China, and also that China was troubled by what happened to the ship. Both positions from the same ministry in the same news cycle. That is not a translation error. That is the unmistakable sound of a foreign ministry being forced to occupy 2 incompatible positions simultaneously because neither one is survivable on its own. To understand why this single boarding operation represents something fundamentally different from every previous escalation in this war, you have to understand the 4-decade relationship between Beijing and Tehran that this seizure has now publicly exposed. This did not start in 2026. It started in 1980, in the opening months of the Iran-Iraq War, when the People's Republic of China began supplying weapons to the Islamic Republic at a scale that would shape the entire balance of power in the Persian Gulf for the next 40 years. By the late 1980s, China had transferred CSS-8 tactical ballistic missiles to Iran, the same missiles that would later become the technological foundation of Iran's Tandar program. China also transferred C-802 anti-ship cruise missile technology, copies of which are now in the hands of the Houthi militia in Yemen, where they have been used to attack commercial shipping throughout 2024 and 2025. These transfers were never fully stopped. New Chinese companies replaced sanctioned ones. New shipping routes replaced interdicted ones. New shell company structures replaced exposed ones. The supply relationship continued underneath the surface, adapting to every layer of international pressure, until by 2026, the architecture connecting Chinese ports to Iranian military programs had become one of the most sophisticated sanctions evasion networks ever constructed. The Tuska's specific role inside that network is now a matter of public record. The vessel belongs to the Islamic Republic of Iran shipping lines, known as IRIS-L, a state-owned company that the United States Department of the Treasury formally designated in 2019 as the preferred shipping company for Iran's proliferation activities and procurement agents. The Tuska is not a rogue commercial operator. It is a known asset of a sanctioned proliferation network operating under direct Iranian state control, attempting to run a U.S. naval blockade with cargo loaded at a Chinese port. Charlie Brown, a former U.S. Navy officer and senior advisor at United Against Nuclear Iran, told the Wall Street Journal on April 20th that the Tuska was carrying something of value to Iran, and that they chose poorly. That phrase captures the strategic miscalculation perfectly. Tehran assessed that the cargo was important enough to risk confrontation. Tehran assessed that the diplomatic complications involving Chinese commercial connections would deter Washington from acting. All of those assessments were wrong. The Marines boarded anyway. The cargo is in American custody anyway. and every assumption that the Iran-China supply chain has operated on for the past decade has just been falsified in a single morning. Now here is where the consequences start compounding globally in ways that most coverage has completely missed. Beijing has spent more than a decade arguing that it is constructing an alternative global logistics network independent of American naval dominance. Chinese investment in port infrastructure, from Gwadar in Pakistan to Hambantota in Sri Lanka, from Khalifa Port in the UAE to Piraeus in Greece, from Mombasa in Kenya to Djibouti at the entrance to the Red Sea, was sold to host countries as commercial development that would diversify their economies away from Western financial systems. The strategic subtext was always different. Beijing was building physical infrastructure that would allow Chinese shipping to operate along routes that did not pass through American-controlled choke points. The Tuska seizure has now demonstrated in a single morning of naval action that this entire framework has a fatal vulnerability. The vessel was not stopped in American territorial waters. It was stopped in international waters in the Gulf of Oman because American intelligence had tracked it from its departure port, monitored its route across the Indian Ocean, assessed the probability of its cargo, and decided the moment was right for interception. Wherever a Chinese-connected vessel goes, American naval intelligence can find it. Wherever it is found, American naval power can stop it. Chinese investment in foreign ports does not insulate Chinese commercial operations from American interdiction. The alternative architecture exists on paper. The American capability to disrupt it exists in practice. And then there is the economic dimension, which is hitting Beijing at the worst possible time. Approximately 42% of China's total crude oil imports come from the 6 Gulf Cooperation Council states. Chinese trade with the UAE alone exceeds $90 billion annually. Chinese investments across Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030 portfolio, Khalifa Port in Abu Dhabi, and Iraqi oil field development represent hundreds of billions in committed capital that only generates returns when the Persian Gulf functions as a stable commercial environment. Every Iranian missile that strikes Saudi infrastructure damages Chinese investment returns. Every Shahed drone that hits an Emirati facility destroys equipment that Chinese companies hold financial stakes in. And here's the contradiction Beijing cannot escape. The same Iranian missile production that the Tuska's cargo was apparently designed to support is the production that is destroying Chinese investment value across the Gulf. China's relationship with Iran is now actively damaging China's relationship with the Gulf monarchies that supply nearly half of its crude oil. There is no diplomatic formulation that resolves this without forcing Beijing to choose between Tehran and Riyadh. The teapot refinery problem makes this economic exposure even more acute. The small, independent processing facilities concentrated in Shandong province, collectively known as the teapot refineries, account for roughly 25% of China's total refining capacity. These facilities were built around a single economic model, processing cheap sanctioned Iranian crude, purchased at heavy discounts unavailable through legitimate channels. The discount was the entire profit margin. When the American naval blockade cut off the supply of discounted Iranian crude in mid-April, those refineries were forced to compete for replacement crude on the open global market at full commercial pricing. Their margins did not compress. They disappeared. Below zero margins across a quarter of China's refining capacity does not produce a manageable adjustment. It produces an industrial crisis that arrives simultaneously as an employment crisis in one of China's most heavily industrialized provinces. And while all of this was unfolding, Russia was watching with the calm satisfaction of a country that had perfectly positioned itself to benefit from everyone else's disaster. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov appeared at the Antalya Diplomacy Forum in mid-April and condemned the American blockade as unlawful, defended Iran's nuclear rights, and performed full solidarity with Tehran for the cameras. In the same statement, he announced that Russia stands ready to supply additional energy resources to China and other countries affected by the crisis. Read that combination carefully. Moscow performing public solidarity with Iran while privately advertising its readiness to replace Iranian oil in the exact markets China requires. Every barrel of Iranian crude that cannot reach a Chinese refinery because of the American blockade is a barrel Russia can now sell to China at increasingly favorable terms. Russian energy revenues since the blockade began have approximately doubled. China's desperation for alternative crude is deepening Chinese dependence on Russian energy at the precise moment Beijing was attempting to diversify away from single-source dependency. Russia is not saving Iran. Russia is monetizing Iran's collapse. The intelligence dimension of what the United States now possesses is the part of this story that receives the least attention and will matter most over the next 12 months. When Marines secured those containers on April 19th, they did not just capture a single shipment, they captured a complete operational picture of how the Iran-China supply network has been functioning. Every container that American analysts are now scanning is a window into the entire logistics architecture. Which specific Chinese companies supplied the chemicals at Gallan Port? how the payment structures were organized to obscure the transaction chain across multiple jurisdictions. Which shell companies in Hong Kong, Singapore, and Dubai served as financial intermediaries? Which freight forwarders coordinated the movement between Tai Kang, Zhuhai, and Port Klang? Which corporate fronts in Malaysia handled the transshipment designed specifically to launder the operational identity of the cargo between its Chinese origin and its Iranian destination? Every node that American intelligence has now mapped is permanently compromised. Iran cannot route the next shipment through the same companies, the same ports, or the same logistics intermediaries without near certainty of detection. Rebuilding that network from scratch is not a trivial task, and it cannot be accomplished while the Iranian regime is simultaneously managing its own internal collapse. The supreme leader has been invisible to the public for more than 50 days. The Iranian economy is bleeding $500 million per day under the blockade by Trump's own public accounting. The rial has collapsed past 1.32 million per US dollar on the black market. Inflation is running near 70%. And in the middle of all of this, the regime is being asked to design a completely new clandestine procurement network for ballistic missile precursors. Trump's casual line on CNBC about a gift from China was not just diplomatic theater. It was an announcement that the supply network had been mapped and that the cost of operating any successor network had just risen by an order of magnitude. The damage to Iran's near-term ballistic missile production capacity is the most immediate operational consequence of the Tuska seizure. The 5 previous IRISL shipments from Gaulan had delivered enough sodium perchlorate to produce propellant for approximately 785 additional ballistic missiles. The Tuska was attempting to add to that stockpile when it was intercepted. With the broader American blockade in place, future resupply runs are now operating against a surveillance environment in which every IRISL vessel approaching a Chinese port is being tracked, every cargo manifest is being analyzed, and every ship-to-ship transshipment in Southeast Asian waters is being photographed. Iran's missile launch rates against Israeli, Saudi, and American targets across the Gulf will fall as existing stockpiles are consumed without replacement. The Fateh, Zulfikar, Qiyam, Khaybar Sheikhan, Haj Qasim, and Fatah missile families that depend on solid fuel propellant from Chinese precursor chemicals will see their production lines slow, then stall. The Iranian deterrent posture against Israel and the Gulf monarchies, which has rested for 2 decades on the credible threat of mass ballistic missile bombardment, is now being measurably degraded for the first time since the program reached operational scale in the early 2010s. Zoom all the way out and look at the complete picture that the seizure of a single cargo ship in the Gulf of Oman has now drawn across the global strategic landscape. A 40-year weapon supply network connecting Chinese ports to Iranian military programs has been publicly exposed. Permanent intelligence leverage has been placed in American hands, leverage that can be deployed in trade negotiations with Beijing, in nuclear talks with Tehran, and in regional diplomacy with the Gulf states simultaneously. The United States Navy has demonstrated that its maritime power can reach any vessel on any route, regardless of flag, regardless of cargo cover story, regardless of diplomatic protection. The trilateral Russia-China-Iran axis that Western analysts spent 3 years describing as the alternative pole of global order is visibly fracturing, with Moscow monetizing Iranian collapse while Beijing struggles to occupy 2 incompatible diplomatic positions in the same news cycle. Iranian ballistic missile production capacity has been measurably degraded, and the logistics network that must now be rebuilt is operating under the most comprehensive maritime surveillance regime since the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. All of this was delivered through a single boarding operation that lasted minutes, required no diplomatic approval, generated no meaningful military response from any party, and produced evidence that will remain in American custody and American leverage calculations for years to come. The captain of the MV Tuska chose to have his engine room blown apart rather than turn around. He made that choice because what he was carrying mattered enormously to the people who sent him. And in making that choice, he handed the United States something worth considerably more than one cargo ship. He handed Washington the map of the entire network. The consequences of that morning in the Gulf of Oman are only beginning to arrive.